The poison apple. There is a plant in your garden, or in a pot on your windowsill, or in the supermarket a few minutes from where you live, that European civilization considered poisonous for 200 years. It is not obscure. It is not exotic. It is the most widely consumed fruit on earth, technically a fruit, botanically speaking, though every chef and every law court in history has argued about this. It is red, mostly, though it comes in yellow and green and purple and the size of a marble or the size of a fist. It is the tomato. The tomato arrived in Europe from the Americas in the first half of the 16th century, carried back by the Spanish conquistadors who had encountered it in Mexico, where the Aztecs had been cultivating and cooking with it for centuries. It was a fruit with a long history, a complex flavor, and an extraordinary versatility that would eventually make it central to the cuisines of Italy, Spain, Greece, Turkey, India, and virtually every other food culture on earth. And for 200 years, Europe looked at it and said, no. They grew it. They admired its ornamental qualities, the red or yellow berries were pretty, and the plant had an interesting shape. They studied it botanically. They wrote about it in herbals and plant catalogues. And they did not eat it, because they were quite certain that it was poisonous, that eating the tomato would make you ill, or kill you, or at minimum cause a very bad time. They were wrong. But they were wrong in an interesting way, a way that reveals something specific about how societies form beliefs about food, about how those beliefs persist long after the evidence against them has accumulated, and about the particular role that class and social hierarchy play in determining what people eat. Tonight, I want to take you through the tomato's history, from its origins in the Andes Mountains of South America, through its adoption by the Aztecs, through its arrival in Europe and 2 centuries of European suspicion, and through its eventual and total triumph. It is a story about a fruit. But it is also a story about how human beings decide what is safe to eat, how they resist evidence that contradicts their beliefs, and how the most mundane objects can carry the most extraordinary histories. Before we go back to the beginning, I want to explain something about the Europeans who thought the tomato was poisonous, because they were not simply irrational. They had evidence. In the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, wealthy Europeans, the aristocracy, the upper classes, were dying with unusual frequency from a condition that looked like poisoning. They had symptoms: abdominal pain, neurological deterioration, gout-like joint problems. And they had, as a common factor, the tomato, which many of them had begun to eat experimentally, despite the general warnings against it. The tomato appeared to be killing them. It was not. What was killing them, slowly, in many cases, through years of low-level exposure, was lead. Specifically, the lead in their pewter plates and platters. Pewter, the alloy of tin and lead that was the prestigious tableware material of the European upper classes, is relatively inert under most conditions. But it is not inert when it comes into contact with highly acidic foods. And the tomato, with its high concentration of malic acid and citric acid, is one of the most acidic foods in common use. When wealthy Europeans put tomatoes on their pewter plates, the acid in the tomato leached lead out of the pewter and into the food. The poor, who ate from wooden plates or earthenware, experienced no such effect. The tomato on a wooden plate was just a tomato. The tomato on a pewter plate was a tomato-flavored lead delivery system. The wealthy ate from pewter and got sick. The poor ate from wood and did not. The conclusion that was drawn, that the tomato was poisonous, was empirically based on real observations. It was just wrong about the mechanism. The tomato's reputation in Europe was not helped by its botanical classification. When European naturalists encountered the tomato in the 16th century and began to classify it systematically, they correctly identified it as a member of the family Solanaceae, the nightshade family. This family includes some of the most toxic plants known to European science: deadly nightshade, or belladonna, henbane, mandrake, Jimson weed. These plants were well known to European herbalists as dangerous, useful in small doses for specific medicinal purposes, lethal in larger doses, and associated in popular imagination with witchcraft and poisoning. The tomato was a nightshade. Therefore, many European herbalists concluded the tomato was dangerous. This reasoning was not entirely unreasonable. The nightshade family is genuinely characterized by the presence of alkaloid compounds, many of which are toxic. The tomato does contain solanine and other alkaloids, primarily in its leaves and stem, which are indeed toxic, but also in small amounts in its fruit when unripe. The caution was botanically informed, even if the conclusion was too broad. The naming of the tomato in several European languages reinforced the negative associations. The Italian word pomodoro, apple of gold, referring to the earliest yellow variety, was relatively neutral. But the French pomme d'amour, love apple, carried associations with both desire and danger. The German word wolf's peach, Wolfsversig, was more explicitly threatening. The English poison apple was the most direct. The 200-year European rejection of the tomato was not uniform. It was stratified by class in a specific and revealing way. The wealthy rejected the tomato. The poor, gradually and then rapidly, adopted it. This reversal of the usual pattern, in which luxury foods flow downward from the wealthy to the masses, reflects the specific dynamics of the tomato's European history. The wealthy had reasons to be suspicious. Their experiences with pewter plates had confirmed the poison apple hypothesis. The poor had less reason to be suspicious, less access to the herbal literature that warned against the tomato, and more immediate reason to be interested in a cheap, productive, calorie-providing food that grew easily in the southern European climate. In the Mediterranean regions of Europe, Spain, southern Italy, Greece, the tomato was adopted by peasant and working-class cooks before it made its way into aristocratic kitchens. The gazpacho of Andalusia, the pasta al pomodoro of Naples, the ratatouille of Provence, these dishes emerged from working-class and peasant cooking traditions before they became the celebrated classics of European cuisine. The irony is exquisite. The tomato that the wealthy rejected as poisonous was adopted by the poor who, eating from wooden rather than pewter plates, survived perfectly well. And then, gradually, the wealthy noticed that the poor were not dying and that the food smelled good. One of the most famous stories in the tomato's American history involves a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson and a courthouse in Salem, New Jersey. The story, as it is usually told, goes like this: on September 26, 1820, Johnson stood on the steps of the Salem courthouse and, before a crowd that had gathered expecting to watch him die, ate a basket of tomatoes. The crowd gasped. Johnson did not die. The tomato was vindicated. This story is almost certainly apocryphal, or at least heavily embellished. Johnson was real, and he did grow tomatoes and advocate for their consumption in the early 19th century. But the dramatic courthouse performance, the waiting crowd, the newspaper coverage that spread the news, these elements are not well documented and may be a later addition to the legend. What the story captures, however embellished, is something real about the tomato's reception in America, that it required active advocacy, that public demonstration was a tool used to overcome resistance, and that there was a moment, sometime in the first decades of the 19th century, when American attitudes toward the tomato shifted from suspicion to acceptance. By 1850, the tomato was in American cookbooks. By 1900, it was in American kitchens. By 1950, it was in American cans, processed into the ketchup and tomato sauce that became global condiments. The transformation from poison apple to essential ingredient took, in America, about 50 years once it began. What is the tomato, actually, from a botanical perspective? The tomato is Solanum lycopersicum, a species of flowering plant in the nightshade family, native to western South America. It produces a berry, technically a berry, by the botanical definition of a fruit whose seeds are enclosed in a fleshy pericarp, that is the familiar red, yellow, green, or purple fruit of commerce. The plant is a perennial in its native range but is typically grown as an annual in temperate climates. It is a warm-weather plant that requires substantial heat to produce its fruit and that is extremely sensitive to frost. The wild ancestors of the modern cultivated tomato were small, roughly the size of a marble or a cherry, and were red or yellow. The larger, fleshier tomatoes that dominate commercial production are the product of centuries of selective breeding, first by the indigenous peoples of the Americas and then by European and American horticulturists. The tomato belongs to the same genus as the potato, the eggplant, and the pepper, all of which were also American in origin and all of which underwent their own complicated processes of adoption and rejection in Europe. The nightshade family was, as a whole, underrepresented in European pre-Columbian cuisine and overrepresented in European post-Columbian culinary history. The specific acidic compounds in the tomato, citric acid, malic acid, ascorbic acid, are responsible both for its distinctive flavor and for its interaction with metal cookware. The same acidity that leached lead from pewter plates also reacts with iron and copper cookware, which is why tomato-based sauces should not be cooked in cast iron for extended periods. Before the tomato became primarily a food, it had a period as primarily a medicine, or at least as a medically interesting substance. In the early 19th century, as the tomato began to overcome its poisonous reputation in America, a brief but enthusiastic movement promoted the tomato as a cure for a wide range of ailments. Pills containing dehydrated tomato were sold as treatments for liver disease, dyspepsia, diarrhea, and indigestion. Physicians wrote articles in medical journals claiming therapeutic effects. A small industry grew up around the medicinal tomato. The claims were, by modern standards, almost entirely unfounded. The tomato has real nutritional value, containing significant quantities of vitamin C, lycopene, and other beneficial compounds, but it does not cure liver disease or dyspepsia in any direct sense. But the medicinal promotion of the tomato was, paradoxically, useful for its broader adoption as a food. By framing the tomato as a health food, as something you should eat rather than something you should avoid, the medicinal advocates of the tomato helped to shift the cultural narrative from danger to benefit. People who would not eat the tomato as a vegetable might eat it as a medicine. The medicine became the food, and the food became ubiquitous. The tomato plant is in the garden. Red fruit hanging from the vine. The particular smell of tomato leaves, sharp and green and slightly medicinal, in the warm air. The fruit that Europe called the poison apple and refused to eat for 2 centuries. In Part 2, we go back further, to the Andes, to the wild tomato's origins, to the indigenous civilizations that first cultivated it and the Aztecs who made it central to their cuisine. Rest here. The tomato is warm from the sun. It has been waiting a long time to be eaten. From the Andes to the Aztecs. The tomato did not begin in Mexico. This is one of the most common misconceptions about the tomato's history, that because the Spanish encountered it in Mexico, in the Aztec Empire, Mexico must be where it originated. In fact, the tomato's wild ancestors come from a different part of the Americas entirely, the Andean region of western South America, in what is now Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. The wild ancestors of the modern tomato grew, and still grow, in the dry coastal deserts and high-altitude valleys of the Andes. They are small plants, producing cherry-sized fruits that are red or yellow or green. They are not particularly appetizing by modern standards, small, sometimes bitter, the fruit that the centuries of selective cultivation that produced the modern tomato's size and sweetness had not yet begun. How a small, somewhat bitter Andean fruit became the most important culinary ingredient in the world is a story that spans several thousand years, 2 continents, and one of the most consequential transfers of biological material in human history. The wild tomato, Solanum pimpinellifolium, the currant tomato, and its close relatives, grows in the coastal deserts and arid valleys of western South America in conditions that would seem inhospitable to most plants. The Atacama Desert, which runs along the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru, is one of the driest places on Earth. Some parts of the Atacama receive no measurable rainfall for years at a time. And yet the wild tomato thrives here, exploiting the coastal fogs that bring moisture without rain, the river valleys that carry Andean meltwater to the coast, the specific microclimates where life is possible in what appears to be a desert. The wild tomato is a survivor. It is resistant to drought, to salt, to a range of fungal and bacterial pathogens that plague cultivated varieties. These qualities of resilience, selected by the harsh conditions of its native environment, are the same qualities that plant breeders are now trying to reintroduce into cultivated varieties to make them more resistant to the climate stresses of the future. The fruit of the wild tomato was eaten by birds and mammals who spread its seeds through their droppings. It was probably also eaten by the indigenous peoples of the Andes, though the evidence for this is indirect. The archaeological record of plant consumption in pre-Columbian South America is incomplete. What is clear is that at some point, probably several thousand years ago, the tomato moved from being a wild plant of the Andean foothills to being a cultivated plant. Someone decided to grow it deliberately, to select the plants with the most desirable characteristics, to save seeds and plant them the following season. The process of domestication had begun. The domestication of the tomato was a gradual process that probably occurred in multiple locations over centuries. Plant domestication works through a combination of deliberate selection and accidental evolution. When humans gather the seeds of wild plants for the following year's planting, they inevitably select for the traits they find most useful: larger fruit, less bitter flavor, more consistent ripening, easier harvesting. Over generations, the cultivated plant diverges from its wild ancestor as these selected traits accumulate. For the tomato, the key traits that domestication emphasized were fruit size, fruit flavor, and fruit color. The wild tomato's cherry-sized berries became progressively larger under cultivation. The bitterness was reduced. The sugar content increased. The range of colors expanded: red, yellow, orange, pink, green, purple, each arising from specific mutations that were selected and maintained by growers who found them attractive or useful. The diversity of tomato varieties that existed in the Americas before European contact was far greater than the diversity available today. Colonial-era Spanish documents describe dozens of tomato varieties in Mexico alone, different sizes, different colors, different flavors, different uses. The introduction of the tomato to Europe reduced this diversity dramatically, because only a small number of varieties made the Atlantic crossing and became the founders of the European tomato tradition. By the time the Spanish arrived in Mexico in the early 16th century, the tomato had been a central ingredient of Mesoamerican cuisine for centuries. The Nahuatl word for tomato was tomatl, which became tomate in Spanish and tomato in English, and it referred specifically to the large, fleshy, cultivated varieties that were the product of long Mesoamerican selective breeding. The smaller, wild tomatillos, green, encased in papery husks, were a different fruit with a different name. The Aztec cookbook, as far as we can reconstruct it from Spanish accounts and from archaeological evidence, was a sophisticated culinary tradition that made extensive use of the tomato in combination with chili peppers, squash, corn, beans, chocolate, and a range of other indigenous ingredients. The tomato was used fresh, dried, ground into sauces, combined with chilies to produce the salsas that are still the foundational condiments of Mexican cuisine. The Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagun, who documented Aztec culture in the 16th century, described tomatoes being sold in the great market of Tlatelolco alongside a remarkable variety of other foods. He listed many varieties: large tomatoes, small tomatoes, sweet tomatoes, sour tomatoes, serpent tomatoes, nipple-shaped tomatoes. The market offered them in every combination, with peppers, with green chilies, with everything. This is the tomato that the Spanish encountered, not a wild fruit of uncertain reputation but a central ingredient of one of the most sophisticated culinary traditions in the Americas, sold in quantities that implied an enormous demand, used in ways that reflected centuries of culinary development. Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors who entered the Aztec Empire in 1519 encountered the tomato immediately. It was unavoidable in a cuisine that used it as constantly as Aztec cuisine did. The Spanish response was, initially, not rejection but curiosity. They were encountering dozens of new foods: chocolate, vanilla, corn, squash, peppers, avocado, and the tomato was one among many. They tasted it, found it edible, and began, tentatively, to incorporate it into their own cooking. The first documented reference to the tomato in European writing appears in a 1544 Italian herbal by Pietro Andrea Mottioli, who described a fruit he called pomi d'oro, golden apples, that had recently arrived from the New World and that some people were eating, cooked with oil and salt and pepper, in the manner of mushrooms. This 1544 description is remarkable for several reasons. It places the tomato in Italy, not Spain, despite the Spanish colonial connection, within about 20 years of Cortés's conquest of Mexico. It describes people actually eating it, which suggests that the Italian adoption of the tomato was faster and more pragmatic than the reputation of European tomato rejection implies. And it describes a simple preparation: oil, salt, pepper, that is still recognizable as a basic Italian approach to tomatoes 5 centuries later. The transfer of the tomato from the Americas to Europe was part of the most consequential biological exchange in human history, the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, named for Columbus, though it was more accurately set in motion by the entire process of European contact with the Americas, was the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Eastern and Western hemispheres that began in 1492 and continued for centuries. The Eastern Hemisphere exported to the Americas wheat, rice, barley, oats, sugar cane, cotton, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, and, devastatingly, the diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, that killed the majority of the indigenous American population. The Western Hemisphere exported to the rest of the world corn, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, squash, beans, chocolate, vanilla, tobacco, and several other crops that would transform global agriculture and cuisine. The potato and the tomato are the two most economically significant American exports in the Columbian Exchange. The potato became the caloric foundation of Irish and Northern European peasant diets. The tomato became the flavor foundation of Mediterranean and eventually global cuisine. It is difficult to overstate how different European cuisine was before the Columbian Exchange. Italian food without tomatoes. Spanish food without peppers. Hungarian food without paprika. Indian food without chilies. Thai food without chilies. All of these cuisines are post-Columbian. They depend on American ingredients that did not exist in their culinary traditions before 1500. The tomato appears in European botanical literature from the 1540s onward, and the early descriptions are revealing about how Europeans initially understood it. The Italian botanist Pietro Andrea Mottioli, already mentioned, was among the first Europeans to describe the tomato in print. His descriptions evolved over his career. His early accounts are relatively neutral, describing the fruit as edible but noting that it was of little use in medicine. His later accounts are more cautious, suggesting that the tomato might cause digestive problems. The Flemish botanist Rembert Dodoens, writing in the 1550s, described the tomato as similar to the mandrake and warned that it was dangerous to eat. This association with mandrake, a plant whose root was believed to have supernatural properties and which was genuinely toxic, attached the tomato to the most dangerous associations in the European herbal tradition. The German botanist Leonhard Fuchs, whose Herbal was one of the most widely read botanical texts of the 16th century, described the tomato as a plant of uncertain utility. His description is careful and empirical. He noted what the plant looked like, where it came from, and what it tasted like, but he declined to recommend it for medical or culinary use. These early herbal descriptions established the template for European attitudes toward the tomato for the following 2 centuries: interesting, exotic, possibly dangerous, definitely not something to eat regularly. The market at Tlatelolco is full. Vendors are selling tomatoes in every size and color, the red ones, the yellow ones, the small ones for salsa, the large ones for cooking. The smoke from the cooking fires rises into the clear Mexican sky. The smell of chili and tomato and corn fills the air. In a few years, the Spanish will arrive and everything will change. In Part 3, we follow the tomato to Europe, through 2 centuries of suspicion and gradual adoption. Rest here. The tomatoes are red in the market sun. They have been red for a very long time. The European rejection. The European rejection of the tomato was not total. This needs to be stated clearly, because the popular account, 200 years of complete European refusal to eat the tomato, is an oversimplification. The reality is more varied, more geographically specific, and more interesting than the simple narrative implies. In southern Europe, in Spain, in Italy, in parts of France and Greece, the tomato was adopted relatively quickly and enthusiastically by working-class and peasant cooks who did not have access to the botanical literature warning against it, who were not eating from pewter plates, and who found in the tomato a cheap, productive, flavorful ingredient that improved their food. In Northern Europe, in England, in Germany, in the Scandinavian countries, the rejection was more complete and more sustained. The climate was less suitable for tomato cultivation, the botanical literature was more widely read and more influential among the educated classes, and the association with the poisonous nightshades was more firmly embedded. In the Americas, in the Spanish colonies of Mexico and Peru, where the tomato was already a central ingredient, the rejection was essentially non-existent. Colonial cooks, drawing on indigenous culinary traditions, continued to use the tomato as a matter of course. The 200-year rejection of the tomato is really a Northern European phenomenon, specific to a cultural and geographic context that had specific reasons for its suspicion, reasons that did not apply in the South or in the Americas. Spain, as the primary colonial power in the Americas, was the first European country to have consistent access to the tomato, and Spanish cooks were among the first Europeans to incorporate it into their cuisine. The early Spanish adoption of the tomato appears to have happened primarily in Andalusia, the southern region of Spain that was also the center of Spanish colonial administration and the port through which American goods flowed into Europe. Seville, the main entry point for American products, had a food culture that was already more cosmopolitan than most of Spain, accustomed to ingredients from across the Mediterranean and the Arab world. Gazpacho, the cold vegetable soup of Andalusia that is now unimaginable without tomatoes, did not originally contain tomatoes. The pre-tomato gazpacho was made from bread, garlic, olive oil, vinegar, and salt, a humble peasant dish designed to use stale bread. When tomatoes arrived in the 16th century and began to be grown in Andalusia, they were added to gazpacho, and the dish was transformed into something much more complex and flavorful. This pattern, an existing dish improved by the addition of tomatoes, was the primary mechanism of the tomato's adoption in southern Europe. The tomato did not replace existing culinary traditions, it enriched them, adding acidity and sweetness and color to dishes that had previously lacked these qualities. The Italian adoption of the tomato is the most consequential in culinary history, because it was in Italy that the tomato found its most important partner, pasta. The combination of tomato and pasta, so fundamental to Italian cuisine that it is difficult to imagine one without the other, is entirely post-Columbian. Before the tomato arrived in Italy, pasta was eaten with olive oil, cheese, butter, and various meat sauces. The tomato sauce that is now the defining condiment of Italian cooking did not exist before the 16th century. The earliest documented Italian recipe using tomato dates to 1692, a cookbook by Antonio Latini that describes a Spanish-style salsa made from tomatoes, chili peppers, and seasonings. This early date, and the Spanish-style preparation, suggest that the Italian adoption of the tomato was influenced by the Spanish colonial connection. But the transformation of Italian cuisine by the tomato was not immediate. The earliest tomato recipes in Italian cookbooks are presented as novelties, interesting preparations of an unusual ingredient, rather than as central elements of the cuisine. The tomato became truly central to Italian cooking in the 19th century, when the combination of tomato sauce, pasta, and the pizza margherita's mozzarella and basil produced the dishes that would make Italian food one of the most internationally influential cuisines in the world. The pizza margherita, created, according to tradition, for Queen Margherita of Italy in 1889, was designed with the colors of the Italian flag: red tomato, white mozzarella, green basil. It was a political statement as much as a culinary one, and it made the tomato the defining symbol of Italian national cuisine. England's rejection of the tomato was more sustained and more class-inflected than that of the southern European countries. The English herbal tradition, represented by writers like John Gerard, whose Herbal of 1597 was one of the most widely read botanical texts in English, was emphatic about the tomato's danger. Gerard described it as of rank and stinking savor and warned that eating it would cause ill health. He grew it in his garden as a botanical curiosity but declined to eat it. The English aristocracy and gentry, who read the herbals and who ate from pewter plates, maintained their suspicion of the tomato through the 17th and 18th centuries. English cookbooks of this period occasionally mention the tomato but typically describe it as a foreign curiosity, something the Spanish or Italians might eat, but not something an Englishman would consider. The poor and working classes of England had less access to the herbal literature and less investment in the aristocratic food culture that sustained the tomato's poisonous reputation. In English ports and in communities with strong connections to Spain, Portugal, and Italy, the tomato was used more freely. But the general English middle and upper class rejection of the tomato persisted into the 19th century. The moment usually cited as marking the end of English tomato rejection is the Great Exhibition of 1851, the international exhibition held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London, which brought international foods and products to English attention in a concentrated and prestigious way. Italian and Spanish producers displayed their tomato products at the exhibition, and the English public, given the opportunity to taste them in a respectable context, began to revise their attitudes. One of the most interesting chapters in the tomato's history is the evolution of tomato ketchup, the condiment that began as a Worcestershire-style sauce containing no tomatoes at all and ended as the most widely consumed condiment on earth. The word ketchup, also spelled ketchup or ketchup, derives from the Hokkien Chinese kutsiap, a fermented fish sauce that was brought to England by traders with East Asian connections in the late 17th century. The English took the concept, a sharp, fermented, savory condiment, and began to make their own versions using mushrooms, walnuts, oysters, and various other ingredients. Tomato ketchup first appeared in American cookbooks in the early 19th century. The recipes were very different from the modern product, more like a thin, vinegary tomato sauce than the thick, sweet condiment that dominates today's condiment market. Over the course of the 19th century, the recipe evolved, more sugar was added, the consistency was thickened, the flavor was standardized. The transformation of tomato ketchup from a variable homemade product to a standardized commercial product was driven primarily by H.J. Heinz, who began producing bottled ketchup in Pittsburgh in 1876. Heinz's ketchup was made to a consistent recipe, preserved with vinegar and sugar, and marketed in the distinctive bottle that became one of the most recognizable packages in American commercial history. By the 20th century, Heinz ketchup had become the global standard, the tomato product that was found in diners, in fast food restaurants, on dining tables across the developed world. The transformation from poison apple to the dominant condiment of modern food culture was complete. The industrial canning of tomatoes in the 19th century was as important as any other single development in the tomato's global triumph. Fresh tomatoes are seasonal, fragile, and highly perishable. A fresh tomato lasts a few days after harvest before it begins to deteriorate. The constraints this imposed on tomato use, geographically, limiting it to areas where tomatoes could be grown, and seasonally, limiting it to the harvest period, were significant barriers to the tomato becoming a truly global ingredient. Canning eliminated these constraints. A canned tomato could be shipped anywhere in the world and could be used at any time of year. The industrial canning of tomatoes began in the 1840s in both Europe and America, and by the late 19th century, canned tomatoes were available in grocery stores across the developed world. The Italian canning industry, concentrated in Naples and the surrounding Campania region, which produced the San Marzano tomato that became the gold standard of canning varieties, was particularly significant. Neapolitan canned tomatoes were exported across Europe and to the Americas, bringing the specific flavor profile of southern Italian cooking to kitchens that could not grow their own tomatoes. The Italian immigrant communities in the United States were the primary market for Italian canned tomatoes in the early 20th century, and through them, canned tomatoes became a staple of American cooking that eventually transcended its ethnic origins. The supermarket shelf of canned tomatoes, in their dozens of varieties and preparations, is the legacy of this process. One aspect of the tomato's history that is rarely discussed is the extensive use of unripe, green tomatoes in cultures where the growing season was too short to ripen all the fruit before frost. In the American South, fried green tomatoes, sliced, battered, and fried before they have ripened, became a classic dish that is now better known through fiction than through actual culinary tradition. In Eastern Europe, green tomatoes were preserved in brine alongside cucumbers and other vegetables as a standard winter provision. The green tomato's flavor is sharper and more acidic than the red, it lacks the sugars that develop during ripening, but it retains the acidity, producing a sour, citrus-like flavor that is different from but not inferior to the ripe fruit's sweetness. The use of green tomatoes reflects the pragmatic relationship between human beings and their food plants, the willingness to use every part of the plant, at every stage of development, rather than waiting for the perfect specimen. It also reflects the specific constraints of northern climates, where the tomato's warmth requirements meant that many fruits would never fully ripen in a typical summer. The tomato is in more kitchens now. Not all of them. Not yet. The northern rejection is still real. The herbal warnings are still being read. But in the south, in the peasant kitchens of Andalusia and Campania, the tomato has been cooking in olive oil for decades, and the smell is impossible to resist. In Part 4, we follow the tomato's global triumph, how it conquered every cuisine on Earth and became the most widely consumed fruit in the world. Rest here. The sauce is simmering. The smell is everywhere. How the tomato won. The tomato won. By any measure, by the acreage devoted to its cultivation, by the tonnage of its annual harvest, by the number of cuisines in which it is now central, by the variety of products derived from it, the tomato is the most successful cultivated fruit on Earth. Approximately 180 million tons of tomatoes are produced globally every year. The tomato is the second most widely consumed vegetable in the world, after the potato. This triumph was not inevitable. A fruit that was considered poisonous for 2 centuries in its largest potential market, that arrived in Europe at a time when Europe was conquering the world and could have spread its culinary prejudices globally, that competes for culinary territory with every other fruit and vegetable in the world. This fruit's global dominance is the result of a specific set of historical processes that could have gone differently at many points. Understanding how the tomato won is understanding something about how food culture changes, about what makes an ingredient acceptable, what makes it beloved, and what turns it from a curiosity into a necessity. The single most important factor in the global triumph of the tomato is the Italian-American immigrant community of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Between 1880 and 1924, approximately 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States. Most of them came from southern Italy, from the same regions where the tomato had been central to peasant cooking for decades. They brought their food culture with them, including their tomato-based sauces, their pasta preparations, their pizza. In America, Italian immigrants opened restaurants that introduced their cuisine to American diners. They established grocery stores that stocked Italian products, including the canned tomatoes that allowed their cuisine to be replicated in any kitchen. They produced tomato-based products, sauces, pastes, purees, that American consumers began to adopt for their own cooking. The process was gradual. In the early decades of Italian immigration, Italian food was ethnic food, something you ate in Italian neighborhoods, in Italian restaurants, something associated with a specific immigrant community. But over the course of the 20th century, Italian-American food, spaghetti and meatballs, pizza, lasagna, became American food, eaten by people of every background, taught in cooking classes, served in school cafeterias. And Italian-American food was tomato food. The tomato was the ingredient that defined the Italian-American culinary contribution to American cuisine, and through American cuisine to global food culture. Pizza is the tomato's greatest triumph. The pizza we know, flatbread with tomato sauce and cheese, is a Neapolitan invention of the 19th century. Earlier flatbreads existed across the Mediterranean, and tomato-topped flatbreads were probably made in Naples before the famous Pizza Margherita of 1889. But the specific form we now call pizza, round, thin-crusted, tomato-sauced, cheese-topped, baked in a wood-fired oven, is Neapolitan. Pizza was street food in 19th-century Naples, sold by vendors to working-class customers who needed a cheap, filling, portable meal. It was not considered sophisticated food, it was peasant food, the kind of thing that upper-class Neapolitans would have been embarrassed to admit eating. The spread of pizza from Naples to the rest of the world followed the pattern of Italian emigration. Italian immigrants brought pizza to America, where it was initially available only in Italian neighborhoods. The Second World War was a significant accelerator. American soldiers stationed in Italy encountered pizza and brought a taste for it home. By the 1950s, pizza was spreading across America, and by the 1980s, it had become global. Today, pizza is the most widely eaten fast food on Earth. It is eaten in Japan, in India, in Brazil, in Nigeria, in every country where food culture has been touched by American influence. And every pizza, every single one, with the exception of white pizzas that deliberately omit the sauce, has tomatoes at its center. One of the most interesting recent chapters in the tomato's history is the discovery of lycopene and its health implications. Lycopene is a carotenoid, a class of pigment compounds that give tomatoes their red color. It is also a powerful antioxidant, a compound that neutralizes the free radicals associated with cellular damage and disease. The health effects of lycopene have been studied extensively since the 1990s, and the evidence suggests that diets high in tomato products are associated with reduced risks of certain cancers, particularly prostate cancer, and with reduced cardiovascular disease risk. The epidemiological evidence from Mediterranean populations, who eat large quantities of tomatoes and tomato products, is consistent with a protective effect. The discovery of lycopene's health benefits did for the tomato's reputation in the late 20th century what the medicinal promotion of the early 19th century had done on a smaller scale. It provided a scientific rationale for consuming tomatoes, a reason to seek them out rather than avoid them. There is a pleasant irony in this. The tomato that was avoided as a poison for 2 centuries turns out to contain compounds that actively protect against disease. The poison apple was, all along, a medicine. In the last decades of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st, a reaction against the industrialization of tomato production produced the heirloom tomato movement. Industrial tomato production had, by the mid-20th century, selected almost entirely for traits suited to mechanized harvesting and long-distance shipping, thick skins that would not bruise in transit, uniform shape and size that would fit sorting machinery, ability to be harvested while still green and ripened with ethylene gas during shipping. The flavor of the industrial tomato had been largely sacrificed to these requirements. The heirloom tomato movement rejected this bargain. It promoted the cultivation and sale of tomato varieties that had been maintained outside the industrial supply chain, varieties selected for flavor rather than durability, varieties that came in unusual colors and shapes, varieties with names like Cherokee Purple and Brandywine and Green Zebra that connected them to specific histories and places. The heirloom tomato movement was partly about flavor and partly about cultural history, about recovering the diversity that industrial monoculture had eliminated. The dozens of varieties that the Aztec market at Tlatelolco had offered in the 16th century had been reduced, by the 20th century, to a handful of commercial varieties. The heirloom movement tried to restore that diversity. The success of the heirloom tomato movement, the farmers' markets, the restaurant menus, the specialty seed catalogs, represents a specific kind of relationship to food, one that values history and diversity alongside the practical considerations of production and cost. The tomato's penetration of global cuisine is so complete that it is easy to forget how recent it is. Indian cuisine, one of the most complex and diverse culinary traditions in the world, with a history going back thousands of years, did not contain tomatoes before the Columbian exchange. The tomato arrived in India with the Portuguese in the 16th century and was initially used primarily by the Portuguese colonial community. Its adoption by the broader Indian population was gradual, accelerating in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, tomatoes are central to many Indian dishes, the base for curries, the foundation of chutneys, the essential ingredient in dozens of regional preparations. The tomato-based gravy that underlies many North Indian meat dishes is so fundamental to contemporary Indian restaurant cooking that it is nearly impossible to imagine the cuisine without it. The same pattern applies to cuisines across Asia and Africa. Thai cooking, Vietnamese cooking, West African cooking, East African cooking, all of these traditions now incorporate tomatoes in significant ways, having adopted the fruit over the past 2 to 4 centuries. The global conquest of the tomato is one of the most remarkable examples of the Columbian exchange's long-term consequences. An Andean fruit, carried to Europe in the 16th century, rejected for 2 centuries, gradually adopted and eventually celebrated, has become central to cuisines on every inhabited continent. Somewhere in the Andes Mountains of Peru, a wild tomato plant is growing. It is small, the fruit is the size of a marble, red and slightly bitter. It grows in a dry valley between the coastal desert and the high peaks, where the fog from the Pacific brings just enough moisture to keep it alive. It has been growing in places like this for millions of years, long before any human being paid attention to it. A few thousand years ago, someone picked the fruit and found it edible. Someone saved the seeds. Someone planted them near their home. And the long, slow process of transformation began, from the wild Andean berry to the cherry tomato, to the beefsteak, to the San Marzano, to the billions of tons that fill the world's markets every year. The Aztecs used it in their salsas and their stews. The Spanish conquistadors brought it to Europe. The Europeans called it the poison apple and refused to eat it for 2 centuries, and then, slowly, through the Mediterranean peasant kitchens and the Italian immigrants in America and the Neapolitan pizza makers, it conquered every cuisine on earth. The poison apple became the love apple. The love apple became pastel pomodoro and pizza margherita and shakshuka and curry and ketchup and the 10,000 other preparations that the world makes with the fruit that almost nobody wanted. It took 500 years from the tomato's arrival in Europe to its complete global dominance. In the history of food, this is actually quite fast. The wild tomato is still growing in the Andes. It does not know what it started. Good night.